folks. Tonight, me and Ryan are getting together to talk a bit about epistemology for this latest installment of our philosophical explorations. And it's a topic we haven't really previously delved into too much. So I'm looking forward to getting into some of the fundamental issues and concepts and theories within epistemology. And we probably won't delve too deeply into the nitty-gritty issues, but we'll give a good broad overview of some of the central concepts, at least I believe, and some of the issues in epistemology, and our individual takes on those issues. So, I guess to begin, Ryan, we can ask the very basic question: what is epistemology? And of course, it's one of the main branches within philosophy, and it's generally defined as, the study of knowledge. I guess it's most people would agree to that, I think, and that comes from a certain etymology of the word itself. Episteme means knowledge in ancient Greek, and logos, of course, means study of or explanation. And so taken together, we have explanation of knowledge, essentially. So that's what we're kind of going to be talking about in the most broadest sense. We're going to be trying to explain what knowledge is. And to go into that definition a bit more specifically, it's the study of knowledge, and it's the study of justification. And some of the things that epistemology inquires about are things like what are the defining features of knowledge? What are the specific conditions of knowledge? What are the sources of knowledge? What are the limits of knowledge and justification? And so these are some of the classical issues that epistemologists look at, and there's various different schools within epistemology, schools of philosophical thought that attempt to approach and answer these kinds of questions. So traditionally, we have one school known as the rationalists, represented by figures like Descartes and Leibniz, and I think Hobbes is usually thrown in there. And they sought to answer these questions about the nature of knowledge using human reason as sort of the authoritative source of knowing. And that's to contrast other schools of thought like the empiricists, who thought that knowledge was primarily derived from our sensory experience with the world through the senses. And key figures within that school, of course, are figures like John Locke and David Hume, and who else was in there? I believe there's a third.
Berkeley.
Berkeley, yes.
Who's a little bit of an outlier, but he's a funny case of that for sure.
Yeah, no, I believe he would have come second in that succession of figures. I think it went Locke, Berkeley, and Hume for the classic empiricists, at least. And I know Thomas Reid is usually thrown into that mix too, but I don't really know a whole lot about Thomas Reid and where he fits into that chronological sequence. But those are two rough and ready camps. The rationalists are generally juxtaposed with the empiricists, although there is a bit of overlap, I suppose. And then we have a figure like Immanuel Kant, who I suppose doesn't neatly fit into either of those categories in a strict sense. I think a lot of what he was trying to do philosophically was trying to reconcile both schools of thought to some degree. And I think a lot of his epistemology blends a bit of the rationalist and the empiricist. So we might touch a bit on Kant in our chat as we go along. I think we most likely will, at least I will. So that's epistemology. For those of you who aren't too up to speed on your basic philosophical branches, and so we're gonna delve deep into epistemology, or sufficiently deep enough, I guess, with the time that we have. So I guess the first pertinent question to ask then, if we're studying knowledge, is, what is knowledge? And within philosophy, there's various ways of defining knowledge. I thought it'd be a good place to start in our conversation would maybe just be a general dictionary definition. so we don't get off too technically and just kind of get reacquainted with what knowledge is, sort of according to our conventional use of the word. So the Oxford Dictionary defines knowledge as, in several senses. In one sense, it's defined as, it's a noun, of course, and it's defined as facts, information, and skills acquired through experience or education, the theoretical or the practical understanding of the subject. And in a philosophical sense, it is true justified belief, certain understanding as opposed to opinion. Knowledge can also refer to as an awareness or familiarity gained by experience of a fact or a situation. And then in this archaic sense, I don't know if this is of any relevance to our foregoing conversation, but it's knowledge was defined as sexual intercourse. So there might be something to that. We might find some connection to philosophy, perhaps. But in any case, that's sort of the conventional dictionary definition of what knowledge is. So I don't know how that rests with you, Ryan, at this stage. It seems pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah, no, it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Glad we're on the same page there. So maybe getting a bit more technical then, we can ask some more specific philosophical question as to the nature of knowledge. And one distinction that comes up, or first one question, is kind of an offshoot of our more general question of what knowledge is what are the kinds of knowledge? So we might want to draw some distinctions between kinds of knowledge, to be more precise in talking about what knowledge is. And one distinction that is typically drawn in the philosophical literature is this distinction between explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. And explicit knowledge is knowledge that we're self-conscious of, that we're consciously aware of. And it's an awareness of whatever is relevant to us in a particular given situation. And so, right now I'm self-conscious of the fact that we're having a conversation about knowledge. So, that would serve as an example. Right now I know we're having a conversation about knowledge. So, insofar as I am aware of that, I know that. Whereas that's in contrast to tacit knowledge, which is an implicit kind of knowledge, which is maybe not immediately available to consciousness. And, I can think, for example, like friends, the phone numbers of certain friends, for example, that I might not, be consciously aware of right now as we're talking. But if I were to pause and reflect, I would be able to recall those phone numbers or any other number of facts of a similar nature. So that's tacit knowledge. And so that's maybe one basic distinction we can use to think about the kinds of knowledge, at least. And that tends to make sense to me. I don't know if it makes sense to you, Ryan, whether you agree with that distinction.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of like tacit knowledge, like the first thing that came to mind is like, I think in psychology we call it like procedural knowledge. Oftentimes it comes down to like, I think about like riding a bike.
Yeah.
I know how to ride a bike, but like, I don't know like propositionally how to ride a bike, or at least not in like immediately. I'd have to like sit there and think about it. Or like when I'm teaching someone like a new skill or like a sport or something, or how to paint, these are all things that I just kind of know how to do. And if I were to teach someone, I'd have to kind of do some sort of self-reflection about like my process in order to teach somebody else, or to like put it into some sort of propositional form.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of associate that with like I said, like a procedural kind of knowledge, something that you do, like some sort of skill.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way of understanding the distinction. You can think, for example, if you've ever been a student, you've been probably tasked to memorize certain facts from a textbook. certain, say, facts about biology or something, what certain organ systems do or something like that. So, that would be an example of explicit knowledge, something you're able to consciously recall. If someone was to ask you, what is the function of the heart? Well, it's to pump blood, and it's to serve these other types of functions. So that's having a conscious awareness of knowledge in that given situation. In contrast, you contrast that type of knowledge with, say, the knowledge of a heart surgeon, and the heart surgeon has a procedural knowledge of how to operate, how to dissect the human body, and to open up the rib cage, and to operate on the heart, and in various ways. And that could be described, I suppose, in explicit terms, using full description, propositional description. But that type of knowledge itself, it's something we could debate about and revisit. This question of, does procedural knowledge reduce to propositional knowledge or declarative knowledge, or is it the other way around? Does propositional knowledge and declarative knowledge reduce to procedural knowledge? So that's a thread I'll just open up there, and maybe I'll just quickly move forward to some of the other distinctions, and then we can get into maybe a more open-ended conversation. So that's the explicit tacit distinction, and these are different kinds of knowledge. There's also, when you're thinking of kinds of knowledge, you can also kind of think about it in terms of different species of knowledge, and there's various ways of thinking about knowledge in that sense. One way philosophers often tend to think of knowledge in as far as different species of knowledge goes is this notion of propositional knowledge, we've just kind of been talking about. And it's basically that, as the name suggests, it's knowledge represented as a set of propositions, linguistic propositions usually. And usually it's something, it's usually, it's a knowledge that something is the case generally. So 2 + 2 = 4 is propositional knowledge insofar as that states something that is the case. You can, generalize that to other examples, different, not just math, but I suppose you could generalize it to different laws in physics.
My favorite is the all unmarried men are bachelors.
That's a classic, yeah.
Yeah, that's the classic one you hear in a lot of introduction philosophy courses on logic and philosophy of language.
Yeah, something that's self-evidently true. And another one I remember from I think it was like a philosophy of language class that I took was like the cat is on the mat.
Yeah.
It can just be simple truths too. It doesn't have to be mathematical or physical, but it could be something quite as simple as all bachelors are unmarried men.
Do they have to be like analytical truths, or like propositional knowledge? I guess too could just simply be like a state of or a proposition about the state of the world. Like, for example, that there's a war in Ukraine right now, or I went to the gym today. That's like some sort of I know that I went to the gym today because I'm sore.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I know that, like I was there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah. Now it seems like we're maybe equivocating a little bit between the definition of propositional knowledge and maybe the ways of knowing a proposition, which we can get into. This is good. I'm glad you're raising these questions. Just thinking of it more like definitionally, I tend to think that a propositional knowledge is a knowledge which is, something that has a truth value, and so all all bachelors are unmarried men. That has a certain truth value, I suppose, and that gets into the question of what the truth is, which we can hit on. So maybe not to linger on this too long. Maybe I'll just get right into non-propositional knowledge, and we can return to these questions. So non-propositional knowledge is kind of converse to propositional knowledge, and often it's talked about in terms of like a knowledge by acquaintance, or by direct awareness. So in thinking about that, I tend to think I know that I'm looking at a desk in front of me right now because I have a direct awareness of that. I can directly perceive that, and to that extent, I'm acquainted. I have an acquaintance with that truth, that type of knowledge. It's a relation between my perception, I suppose, and I'm not sure what else, but
yeah. I think we're going to get into this distinction going down there, but it seems like propositional knowledge is sort of, actually, I don't think we're going to get into it, but it's like the difference between analytic and synthetic.
Okay.
Analytic knowledge is, again, based off of, it's definitionally true that all unmarried men are bachelors.
Right.
Whereas, non-propositional or perceptual knowledge, it's telling you something new about the world. It's synthetic knowledge. It's telling you that, there's iced tea on my desk. It tells you something new about the state of the world that isn't obviously true by definition.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good example. I remember when I took my first epistemology and metaphysics class many years ago now. I remember I was taking with Joshua Mazursky, who was an epistemologist and metaphysician at Queen's University. And he drew this distinction between ampliative and non-ampliative knowledge. Okay. So ampliative knowledge is like an additive type of knowledge. It's something like the knowledge that you have a iced tea glass on your desk. It's additive. It's not something that is based on a definition, like on an analytic truth. Like an analytic truth would be non-ampliative to the extent that all you have to do is be acquainted with the definition of the concept and what the concept is. Whereas, I didn't know that you had a glass of iced tea on your desk because I can't perceive that. I don't have that, direct acquaintance with that experience.
Yeah. So in one case, like propositional knowledge is, you could say non-ampliative or analytically true or universally true, whereas the other one, it's the non-propositional knowledge, it's synthetically true, it's ampliative, mm-hmm. or it's contingently the case. Like later on, the glass might not be on my desk, for right. example, right? It's not always the case, or it doesn't always have to be the case that's true.
Right. I think that claim you just made is maybe true to an extent, but I don't think it generalizes to all cases of propositional and non-propositional knowledge. And we can get into that a little bit more. I have some notes written down on that precise topic. Maybe before going into that, there were just a few remarks that I wanted to touch on about Kant, because Kant had some interesting things to say about perceptual knowledge and non-propositional knowledge. And he talked about how what one perceives to be true is true for that person. And so perception for Kant to some degree is sort of a direct window to the truth. But there's more to it than that, of course. And So I thought it would just be interesting to highlight that point. And so there's this idea of perception being, in some sense, I don't know if it's necessarily primary to knowing, but it's definitely central to knowing. Another type of knowledge, which we sort of briefly touched on, is knowledge of how to do something, like procedural knowledge. Knowing how to ride a bike is different from, understanding the physical equations which explain how to ride a bike. And, the latter case would be, the former case would be an instance of knowing how to do something, which is to some degree seems to be somewhat ineffable in nature. Kant, to ride a bike, goes beyond a mere propositional understanding of how to do it. I mean, in learning to ride a bike, a parent, for instance, might give you some verbal pointers about how to do it. Kind of like evenly balance your weight on both sides of the bike, put both hands on each side of the hand, one hand on each handle, and keep your head up, and so on and so forth. So we can describe this in propositional terms. And that can help, I suppose, someone learn the procedural knowledge. But once someone has learned the procedural knowledge, it almost seems like there's sort of a automaticity to that type of knowing and an ineffability to it as well.
That's how I viewed your example of the surgeon. Like you would learn propositionally how to conduct heart surgery, but I think once you're experienced enough, like even like a new surgeon, they graduated and they finally get, into a hospital and they're doing heart surgeries, they might even walk themselves through it propositionally at first, like in their own head, or even with their supporting staff. But I think after enough experience, and if it's just like a routine heart surgery, it probably is just sort of like almost automated, and it's definitely more procedural and less propositional. It doesn't need to be aided by the propositional knowledge as much.
Mm-hmm. No, I like how you link that back to the heart surgery example. And as you were describing that too, it sort of brought to mind some things that I've learned about learning types of behaviors from my behavioral psychology course that I've taken. And I'm not sure if you've taken that course as well. I took it with Professor. I took it with Professor Polson at the University of Victoria. But he goes. We went into a lot about in teaching a sequence of actions. Behaviorists and behavioral psychologists have this notion of chaining, and so you kind of have a sequential ordering of actions, which I suppose you could enumerate in like a numerical sequence, like it's like making your bed, for example. You want to teach someone with a developmental disability how to make a bed. You give them a precise, linear, enumerated sequence of actions for them to carry out in making a bed. And so that enumerated sequence could be a series of propositions. First, grab the comforter and lay it on the mattress, and then take the your base sheet, and then fold that over the top of the mattress, and so on and so forth until you have a completely made bed. And I suppose that's used as a form of conditioning to help that person learn the sequence of actions for making a bed. And I suppose if you were to do that often enough, with enough reinforcement, they would be able just to automatically do that. They might have to be more challenged than I suppose your average person to do that. But nonetheless, that's I guess another illustration and maybe more of a technical explanation, bringing in this concept of chaining.
I think I see that a lot in sports and stuff too. Like if you're learning a new skill in a sport, you start with like the first step and you master that, and then you add the next step. And it's like just sort of this chaining of actions until the whole sequence can be performed without sort of like your coach there, or like someone kind of like guiding you. It's like, oh no, like, correct your posture, or, whatever it is, and then eventually it just becomes, automated, and you can perform this new skill. So I've definitely seen that put into use.
Right. Yeah, no, they're good examples. I think they help kind of hammer home the point of this this interplay between both propositional and procedural. Which comes first? It's a chicken and egg type of question. I don't know. We might be able to arrive at some answer at some point. I don't know if I have one at the moment, but in any case, that's something we can maybe revisit. Then I wanted to just briefly talk about another distinction between, as far as kinds of knowledge goes, and this is this distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge. These are Latin terms that philosophers like to use, especially the early modern philosophers, like the likes of Immanuel Kant, especially. And these are just highfalutin terms that have sort of intuitive meanings once you kind of define what these terms are. But a priori knowledge is generally it's usually non-empirical knowledge that's not immediately derived from your sensory experience of the world. We might even just equate it with propositional knowledge as we've been discussing it, and that contrasts a posteriori knowledge, and that type of knowledge is generally knowledge which is derived from the sense, depends upon our sensory and our perceptual experience. And so that's sort of the basic gist of the distinction. And Kant was a famous philosopher who talked about this distinction, of course, and he held that that the justification for a priori knowledge comes from certain intellectual processes that he called pure reason or pure understanding. And sort of a textbook example in Kant of these examples of pure reason and pure understanding are things like logical and mathematical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4, or sort of a logical inference rule like modus ponens, like if P then Q, I suppose, would also serve as an example. So I guess the major task for epistemologists is to try to make sense of this distinction, and to kind of account for what exactly is a priori knowledge, what exactly is a posteriori knowledge, and also this issue too of how those types of knowledge, they're not simply a kind of knowledge, but they're also sort of a way of knowing. And so we could get into that a little bit too. And I guess one last thing I'll just hit upon, and maybe we can get into this a bit more deeply, is this question of what is the standard analysis of knowledge? So within epistemology, epistemologists like to talk about knowledge in terms of this tripartite division of what knowledge is. And these 3 conditions include a belief condition, a truth condition, and a justification condition. So many epistemologists hold that for you to know something requires that your knowledge be based upon a belief, that it be a true belief, and that it also be a and justified belief. So that's just a basic inventory of some of the central questions within epistemology, and some of the central ones that we can discuss about in our conversation. So I don't know if you have anything there to add, Ryan. This is all, hopefully this is kind of all makes sense, and I don't know if there's any questions you have about any of it so far.
No, I think you've done a really good job of explaining all that so far. Do you say you wanted to get a bit more into like what the the belief condition, truth condition, and justification conditions are? I think you have some written down a little bit later, right?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Okay.
We can get into that. I'm happy to get into that, of course. We can maybe start with belief if you want, and start unpacking what each of these terms means. So, what is a belief? Is the next question to ask. The Oxford Dictionary definition of belief states that belief is a noun, and that it can be defined as an acceptance that something exists or is true, especially something to be true without proof. So I suppose something that seems obviously true, like the earth is round, perhaps. And belief can also be something one accepts as true or real, so like a firmly held opinion. It can also refer to a religious conviction. It can also refer to as a belief in something as well. So a belief in oneself, self-trust, for example, or faith or confidence in something or someone. So that's sort of the dictionary definition of belief. And also, it's there's more to it than that, of course. But basically, that's what a belief is. So, I mean, that makes intuitive sense to me, at least. It's a belief, in the one sense, it's suggesting that a belief is something, a belief is almost a metaphysical statement. It's a statement of something being true, something existing, so I believe that I'm looking at a Himalayan salt lamp on my desk right now, I accept that this lamp that I'm looking at right now exists, and so I can try and prove that. I could say, well, here, take a look, and I could point my camera at it. But that's not always the case. I think we often, a lot of our beliefs, we don't necessarily always seek to prove them. We just take them for granted.
Yeah, but belief is definitely like a certain relationship we have with the truth. I would say, like, one thing I wrote down while I was reading, I think it was from the Stanford Philosophy Encyclopedia. It said, this is on truth. I know we're talking about belief, but truth is a metaphysical as opposed to epistemological notion. Truth is a matter of how things are, not how they can be shown to be.
Okay.
So I think that's kind of like an important distinction to make. So like sometimes we think about truth and we automatically associate it with epistemology, but in some way it is also related to metaphysics. And I think, belief maybe is somewhere kind of in the middle there. Where we believe something to be the case. We could believe some sort of metaphysical truth about the way that the world exists, separate from our perception. But you don't really get into the epistemological side until we talk about like justification and how our belief then sort of translates into knowledge. So that's kind of why I feel like it's somewhere in between the sort of like the metaphysical and epistemological, just because it doesn't quite have that justification built into it, but it's still a relationship with the truth. It can have a relationship with justification, but it doesn't always need to.
No, it doesn't. No,
be justified, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good observation you point out. That truth, in some sense, is perhaps more fundamentally a metaphysical concept, and and truth in and of itself doesn't say anything about what justifies the truth. It's true that I'm wearing a yellow sweater right now, but that doesn't say anything about what justifies that true statement. I could offer justification, but then I guess we're going beyond just mere truth.
We get into the justification condition.
Yeah, no, for sure. I guess another thing I just wanted to briefly touch on too with belief is that belief is an acceptance. So it's it's the acceptance of a certain proposition, for instance, and to that degree, it's kind of a self-conscious and a self-aware type of process. In declaring something to be true, you are accepting that truth. I accept that. I'm sitting down in my chair right now, looking at my laptop, having a conversation with you right now. And so, to that degree that I accept that proposition, to that degree it's true. So if there wasn't that act of acceptance there'd still be truth.
There'd still be truth, but there wouldn't be knowledge.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I think, if I heard you correctly, it's
right.
Like, we have a belief in something, and we could be justified in, like, I see you're wearing the sweater, right? I believe you're wearing a yellow sweater. By all means, I feel like I'm justified. I think most people say I'm justified in believing that you're wearing a yellow sweater. You've told me you're wearing a yellow sweater. I can see it. But even though I'm justified, it still could be the case that it's not true. Right?
Right.
You could have edited, like tweaked the color on your camera or something. It still could be the case or the fact that I believe it and the fact that I'm justified in believing it doesn't mean that it's true.
Right.
Right. It still could be the case that you're messing with me.
Right.
Even if I have like all reasons to believe that you're not.
Right. So in other words, you might not accept that truth, and you might instead reject it because you might have some reasons or justification for doing so. Maybe you have jaundice, maybe your color perception is tainted yellow.
Yes, yeah. Like, I mean, I know my eyesights are good. I know you're not particularly known as a prankster, so I'm justified in believing that you're wearing the yellow sweater, even though you might have just decided today that you're not or that you're gonna be a prankster or something.
Yeah, no, I spray painted my black sweater right before our conversation.
But I think it's interesting the interplay between the different conditions, like the truth condition. Something could be true, even though I have no way of knowing what the truth is. Something could be true, and I could think otherwise, and I could be justified in thinking otherwise based on the evidence that I have. It still wouldn't be knowledge because my belief and the justification I have for believing what I believe doesn't actually line up with the truth. So I don't actually know, but it's interesting the interplay between the different conditions of this. Like, I've been thinking about it for the last week. It'd be interesting to maybe sit down and I'll write down kind of maybe like a little blog post or something about this to get a little more clear on what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, often that's a good pathway to greater clarity is to try to write and articulate your thoughts, and that can help to clarify exactly where you stand on a lot of these issues. I think the tripartite definition of knowledge as justified true belief is useful, and I think it's a good way to kind of begin thinking about some of these issues, whether or not we think that it's an ultimately, valid model or way of thinking about knowledge. I think it at least makes a lot of intuitive sense, I think, in certain respects. And maybe before we get on to justification, just thinking about truth maybe a bit more technically in terms of how philosophers have thought of truth. There's various different notions of exactly what truth is in a more of a philosophical sense. In one sense, there's this correspondence theory of truth. So according to this theory, truth is basically an agreement of some sort. So usually it's an agreement between, say, a proposition and an actual situation. So, for example, if I say the cat is on the mat, well, if there is actually a cat on the mat, then there's a correspondence between my propositional utterance, the cat is on the mat, and the actual fact that there is a cat on the mat. So there's actually no cat on the mat in my room at the moment, although there are 2 cats in my house. But in any case, that's besides the point. But you get the point.
Yeah,
it's this correspondence notion.
That's like Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, like early Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein talks about, sort of like painting a picture, and there's some sort of relationship between the picture that's been painted by the person's propositions. Or you can literally paint a picture of the situation. But anyways, there's some sort of picture that we're painting with the things that we're saying. And there's some sort of correspondence between the picture that we've painted for somebody with the words and the language we use and reality. And the correspondence between those things makes the proposition true. The correspondence between the picture and reality is what makes the proposition true.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. It would be like, the statement, I'm having a conversation with you right now over Zoom about the nature of epistemology. That would agree with some state of affairs in reality. Specifically, the fact that, yes, we are in fact having this conversation over Zoom about the nature of epistemology. And so as far as correspondence theory of truth goes, that's how that theory wants to account for the truth and for understanding the truth. Another way of understanding is this coherence theory of truth, and it's somewhat different. Instead of agreement, we have interconnectedness, and we have interconnectedness between proposition or a system of propositions. And so, to think of to put this more concretely, for example, also, I suppose this conversation we're having over Zoom right now, it's true that we are having this conversation over Zoom right now. And well, what is the basis of that? Well, it's not necessarily an agreement between a proposition and the fact that we are, but it's more of a coherence between different propositions. So how might we put this concretely? I suppose, I can visually perceive we're having this conversation. I'm looking at my laptop and I can see you displayed on my laptop. Plus, I might believe that that's what, in fact, we're talking about, because to my knowledge, according to my own self-awareness, we're currently having a conversation right now about epistemology. I also know that we are because, I have no reason to believe that I'm being deceived in any way. My visual perception is fine. I'm not I haven't taken any hallucinogens or anything. I know there's no evil demon, deceiving me about my perceptions about the world. I remember that we specifically planned to have this conversation tonight at this time. So I guess to that extent, there's all these different propositions that are kind of that cohere, that are kind of linked together in this like web of belief. And I can I can appeal to any one of those propositions to support the truth. Well, I guess we're not talking about justification, but to know that it's true that I am indeed having this conversation with you over Zoom right now.
I think about it like too in terms of like contradiction. Like if you have a set of propositions, someone can tell you a story, like say something happens and you're like, man, what happened? Like, how did that, tell me your story. Like think about, someone being interrogated by police and they tell a story, and there's parts of the story that just simply aren't coherent with the set of facts that the police have already been given either by that person or by other people. So there's something missing. There's something that's amiss with the propositions that you're being given in that situation that don't cohere with things that you already know to be true.
Right.
Like say for a fact, you've done your research that the person was, at the hockey game during, this time and that time, and the person says, "Oh, I was out of town." Well, that's not coherent with the set of facts that already exists. Like the police have seen you on the footage, they have your debit card receipts and everything. Like, so that's kind of the way I see coherence theory. I don't know if that kind of fits with what you were saying, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose you could have a specified system of propositions within that story. The proposition that so and so was at the hockey game at a certain time, and that there were people there to witness that fact, and that person has receipts that they were at the game. Receipts of like their ticket or food they might have purchased at the food kiosk or whatever. So it's like this. It's this. It's the fact that all of these propositions seem to cohere with one another within this. In this, in telling this broader story, and any kind of, I suppose, proposition you might introduce into that relationship of propositions that would contradict those other propositions would not cohere. So to that degree, then that proposition would be false because it's not coherent with the other propositions.
Or at least in doubt in some sense.
Yeah, or in doubt, of course, yeah. So that's another theory of truth. And then I suppose another way of thinking about the truth, another theory to consider is sort of the pragmatic theory. And with this theory, we could ask, this theory is essentially stating that truth is to some extent useful. So a specific proposition, for example, is true to the extent that it is useful. So, basic, say, arithmetic facts like 2 + 2 being 4, or any other arithmetic or algebra or whatever is true to the extent that it's useful. And of course, mathematics is highly useful. It allows us to do all these different calculations and computations for different practical purposes, budgeting for, all sorts of things, of course. And so to that degree, a proposition can be true insofar as it is useful. And, I think that's a fairly intuitive sense of truth, I suppose. And it wouldn't just extend to like basic practical matters, but also things like certain moral truths, believing that it's wrong to kill another person, believing that it's wrong to tell lies. Generally these are generally it's useful to tell lies and to
Whoa, showing your colors there, Graham.
Yeah, no, Freudian slip there or something. No, but generally, on the whole, it's useful not to tell lies, and it's useful to tell the truth. Although,
I was gonna say, so your shirt really isn't yellow.
I've been found out.
Yes.
Yeah. But in any case, that's pragmatic truth, and just a few simple examples. So those are certain ways of thinking about truth. Then we can think about justification and what justification is in this tripartite division. And the Oxford Dictionary defines justification as a noun. And it's basically the action of showing something to be right or reasonable. It also can be defined in a similar way as good reason for something exists or that something has to be done. I think there's other definitions, of course, but I think these are the most relevant ones as far as epistemology goes. The action, so again, the action of showing something to be right or reasonable, or a good reason for that something exists or has to be done. So what strikes me about this definition is that this idea of something being reasonable, or a reason for something existing, or reason for something having to be done. I think that's generally what we do a lot when we're trying to justify something. We're trying to provide good reasons for what we're justifying, and in this case, we're trying to justify knowledge. So how do we justify knowledge? That's a question. And so maybe we can just begin with that, I suppose. Justified true belief. So within that equation, what is justification, and how does it support our knowledge?
Well, I mean, I think the good example is science, repeated testing, a buildup of evidence for a certain proposition. I think that's one obvious example. There's more, casual examples, like, you have a friend that you really trust. They tell you a story. You have no reason to believe that they're being dishonest with you. You know them to be an honest person, an honest friend. So in that sense, I would say you're justified in believing what they're telling you to be the truth. So I think it really depends on what we're trying to justify, what belief we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And what position we are in epistemically. I'm not a scientist, and I still believe the claims of science, not for the same reason that a physicist will believe the claims of physics. They have maybe a different standard or a different bar that they need to believe a proposition in that field. But for me, a physicist says something, and to me, that's all the justification I need, and I don't think that there should really warrant any more justification, considering I'm not a scientist.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of conditions on that, on justification, like what is the claim, and who are we hearing it from? Where are we getting our evidence, and who are we to assess that evidence?
Right. Yeah, no, I think I would agree. I think that justification is somewhat of a complex notion, and there's various ways of justifying something. We can justify something through various reasons that could be somewhat different. Like, I can acknowledge that I am sitting down right now in my chair at this desk having this conversation. I can justify that by various means, by the fact that I can actually perceive that to be the case. I can also perhaps describe it propositionally in some way. I can see that I'm currently sitting down here right now having this conversation. I can, there's various ways for me to explain that and to justify that with reasons. Maybe going beyond just a mere personal example to something like more scientific in nature, like the fact that the world is round. I know that to be a true and justified belief because I've seen, satellite pictures of the planet being a spherical shape. I know that the scientific consensus is that the Earth is round and that there's no good evidence to believe that it's flat, and so on and so forth. So, there's different ways of justifying it, maybe different at different levels, with maybe different depth of detail and different depth of scientific reasoning.
Yeah, and I guess too, it's like, what is your intention with the knowledge, right? Like, again, going back to the scientist's perspective, like a physicist, presumably physicists are going to do something with their knowledge, or like at least engineers are going to do something with their knowledge. And so I feel like the bar for justification has to be higher than, say, like my bar for I'm not an engineer and I'm not a physicist. I don't need to be as certain as them because the consequences aren't as severe if I'm wrong, like the consequences of some formula in quantum mechanics being wrong for me is not the same as for a physicist or an engineer or something. And so I think they want to be more certain than I would of those things. And I think that's fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perhaps there's different standards of justification depending on what your vocation is. And if you're a scientist, for example, the standards for justification are going to be, the bar will be set much higher than it is for, say, the layman or the layperson. And if you are a scientist, like I know you and I both have a background in psychology, and we know what it involves in conducting a study and in coming up with a sort of a relationship between two variables, between an independent variable and independent variable, and the independent variable being what we're sort of implicating as the factor that it's affecting the dependent variable, right? So, and this can be a correlational relationship, or it could be a causal relationship. But in either case, we're, I suppose, we're requiring a more sophisticated justification for substantiating any claims about a correlation between two variables, or about a causal relationship between two variables. Like, for example, say the relationship between exercise and well-being. So we might say that there's a positive association between exercise and well-being. The more that the more volume of exercise, for example, the higher the scores that someone will have on like subjective well-being. And we know that because we are able to observe. We're able to quantify, that person's, say, mood at baseline. Maybe they're out of a score of 1 to 10, they're maybe 4. They don't feel too great. They feel a little bit depressed, a little bit anxious. and then after, you know, implementing, say, an exercise intervention, you know, they're asked to fill out their an inventory again, and they're after the exercise, their well-being score goes up to like 8 out of 10 or something. And so we have quantitative data which we can use to justify this association between you know, exercise and enhanced mood. And we can even add on to that, like, what is the mechanism that accounts for that relationship? Or we could say, well, because there's an increase in, you know, monoamine neurotransmitters, that person's serotonin and their norepinephrine and their dopamine levels are all much higher now, and that correlates with higher well-being scores. So there's additional justification there as well. So that's just getting kind of into the complexity that justification can take on, I suppose, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think like the more, like, you know, if you're a psychologist doing the study, you want to have more of a justification for believing sort of the relationship. You know, can't just like, if you're going to make it like a causal claim about the relationship, you want more evidence and say, like, your everyday person, you know, your everyday person will just see, oh, might be happy with the correlation, right? They don't need to know all the other nitty-gritty details or something like that.
Yeah, there's more. So maybe we can even like raise the bar even higher if we're going beyond mere correlation to causation. You know, the standards of justification are going to have to be much more higher and stringent, and maybe have to meet certain normative criteria or something like, you know, within experimental psychology, you know, there's this distinction between like a correlational study and like a true experiment. And I forget what exactly a true experiment involves. I think it usually like involves a control group and other conditions.
Yeah, control group, usually a placebo group, an experimental group, and yeah, a bunch of other conditions as well. You know, a randomized selection, you know, basically conditions that no experiment ever has.
Yeah. Hence the preponderance of correlational studies, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, especially considering in the field of psychology, anyways, it's a little bit better, I'd say, in like medicine or even like psychiatry. You know, I think it's a little bit easier to get a representative sample for some of these things, but most of these studies are being done on largely affluent university students, you know, in North America, you know, also largely white, you know, of a particular ethnic group. Now, in psychology, a lot of the psychology students, it's actually quite female heavy, from my experience. So maybe it's not quite as bad in that sense. It's maybe a bit more balanced than some of the other, you know, programs, maybe a bit more diverse. But there is still, you're selecting from a particular demographic of people who chose to go into psychology, you know, people who have the money to go to college, things like that. So
Yeah,
you have some biases or some confounding variables, I think is the more appropriate term.
Sure. Yeah. There's smaller sample size and everyone from a similar demographic, which might not give you might not be representative of the broader population. And so those are confounding variables that can interfere, I suppose, with your ability to identify a relationship between a set of variables. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are all valid points you bring up there. I think that touches on sort of the basic concepts, the basic distinctions, the basic analysis of knowledge. With the time we have remaining, maybe we can get a little bit Kantian, if you're open to that. And because Immanuel Kant, at least I'd like to get Kantian. feel free to discuss whoever you'd like to discuss. But I think I find Kant to be interesting, and a good exemplar, I suppose, of a lot of the concepts we've already been discussing. And he offers some unique answers to a lot of these questions we've been asking, like questions like, what do we know? And so, Kant's answer to a first approximation is that certain sciences and certain disciplines can be known, such as mathematics and geometry. But he would also add that the knowledge of these sciences is not a knowledge of the things as they are in themselves, but only as they appear to us. So he would say something like, anything that we claim to be facts, whether they be mathematical or geometrical, certain mathematical equations or certain geometrical equation, for instance, we can know them, but we can't know those things that we do know about those things don't say anything about the world in and of itself beyond, I suppose, our perception of those things.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it is very much like that. All knowledge that we have has experience as the subject. It's always in some way about human experience. It's either about human experience in the sense that like we had a certain experience and we're talking about it, or it's about the nature, the underlying sort of structure of human experience. So like the synthetic a priori that Kant sort of comes up with is sort of revolutionary idea, being that all experience occurs in accordance with the law of cause and effect.
Right.
It's some sort of metaphysical knowledge in a sense, but it's still, the subject matter is our experience. It's not about the world as it is separate from our experience. It's some sort of knowledge about the structure and the kind of thing that makes human experience possible, like the kind of human experience that we have possible.
Right.
So whatever it is, whatever knowledge we have, the subject matter is in some sense human experience.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And, I think in knowing, it's really hard to go beyond experience in some sense. We're always, I suppose, operating from a certain frame of reference, from a certain subjective point of view, and it would seem that knowledge in some sense, is very phenomenological, based upon, how things seem to us in our experience. And, it's also to say that, in making a claim to know something, we are, we bring something to that experience. And that thing we bring to the experience, I suppose, would be the a priori way of knowing something, like cause and effect, like a law of causation. If I drop a glass on a hard surface from a sufficient height, I know if I drop the glass from a sufficient height on a hard surface, that it will shatter upon impact. And that doesn't say anything about the world in and of itself beyond the way that I perceive it. I bring to this experience a certain category of causation, and in some sense I superimpose this upon reality to some degree.
Yeah.
And
I think that idea of laws of physics is a good example, right? Like, I think our intuition as laymen is to see these laws like the laws of physics is talking about the world, like, separate from us, just the way that the world is. But I think what Kant's trying to say is like, it's not actually about that. Like even the laws of physics and the equations we use, they're still in some sense about the world as we experience it, you know? And I mean, maybe you could push back on that and bring up quantum mechanics because we certainly don't experience, but it still is in some way about the world that we experience. You know, it's a step removed, but it is still about, you know, it's, maybe we'll get into it after. It's kind of
Yeah.
like a long digression, but I think Kant would kind of say something like that, that these laws of physics are still, the subject matter is still human experience.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think maybe a modern scientific worldview too might agree with a lot of Kant's insights, and I think even something like quantum mechanics or quantum physics, you know, um, does not necessarily undermine Kant, but maybe in some degrees might even support Kant. You know, if you look at things like the double slit experiment, and
Yes.
you know, basically, I don't want to offer to like a character of it or anything, but it's generally kind of this experiment that physicists have set up where if you observe light from a certain perspective, you'll either perceive it as a particle or as a wave. If I'm getting it right. And so depending on the way that you're perceiving the light, it will appear to you differently. So you might almost say that, well, there's some sort of a priori perceptual mechanisms or processes we bring to that experience, which actually alters the way we perceive reality, and that therefore alters the way we know reality in a certain situation.
Yeah, the double slit experiment is a really interesting example. And I think it has to do with like the presence of an observer versus no observer, right? Like
Right, yes.
they have someone observe the light and it acts as a particle. And when you don't have someone observing it or measuring that, it behaves more as a wave.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah. I guess what I was sort of getting at was, you know, we think of like quantum particles, or we think of like atoms and electrons, and they seem so far removed from our experience and the way that we experience the world. But really, these are models of the world that we experience. They seem so abstract, and they are. But these equations and things, they are still models, ways of modeling the world, the kind of world that we experience. They might not seem intuitive, but they still are models of human experience and in the way that we perceive the world.
Right. So like a model of the atom, for example, does not necessarily reflect reality in and of itself, but it reflects the way that we model reality. And it reflects that the way that we perceive reality and the way we interact with reality. And and I mean, I would also add that even when we can develop and design scientific instruments which help us better to perceive that reality, like microscopes for perceiving microorganisms or something, still even at that, we're still perceiving that reality through our perceptual our perceptual faculties. And Kant would say we bring something to that experience that shapes it in that specific way, and therefore we're not perceiving the microorganisms under the lens as they are in and of itself, but through the human idiosyncratic way of perceiving things.
Yeah, and even in like, I think the atom was modeled before it was ever seen or like observed through an electron microscope, but still that's mediated through our understanding. That's still shaped by our cognition, and I guess I can't remember what Kant calls them, but through, I guess, the categories, of our mind. Even before we saw these things or perceived them in some way, we modeled it, but it was still under the categories of human understanding,
right,
and human reason.
right. Yeah. Well, hold that thought. We can return to it. Maybe I'll just return briefly to Kant and see if we can sharpen some of our conceptual understanding about this. So this next question I wanted to bring up, which just kind of ties into somewhat what you were just talking about, was this question of how do we know? What are the processes that are involved in knowing? And so Kant of course, has his own answer to this question. And he talks about how the world that we experience and the forms within our experience that we perceive are determined by what he calls our sensibility. So I'll get into what that means. He also talks about how all of our sensory experiences are basically spatio-temporal in nature. So they are, our perceptions occur within space and time. And that therefore all our perceptions and everything we can imagine can be known a priori in virtue of the forms of our sensibility. So the forms of our sensibility are space and time.
Yes.
And so we to any experience we have, we bring these forms to that experience. So this is kind of seems to be immediately true to me. I mean, I always seem to perceive myself as a subject located in space and time. I kind of can perceive myself as a distinct form that is, in some sense, separate in space from the other forms around me. I'm sitting at my desk right now, but I'm not. I'm not. I can visually see that I am distinct from my desk, and that it is going up just past 9:30 my time, because my experiencing of the world is also temporal in nature. So it occurs in space and time, and these are things that I bring to that experience. These are things that I know in some sense a priori, because they're not in the objects themselves, but they're part of the way that I perceive the world independently of those objects, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember it was like the example he gave was basically just imagining, like, just take away everything, and what are you left with? And it's just space and time. It's just like when you just have like a blank slate, all there is just space and time just sort of ticking forward, Might be some interesting questions there with certain substances.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to time, and maybe in a bit with space as well. But I've definitely had experiences where time seems to stop in some sense, or it seems to be like repeating or folding in on itself. Maybe that's something that we can revisit in sort of like a psychedelic podcast, or
Sure.
Yeah,
the experience of timelessness. Yeah, I know too, like certain scientists like Einstein, didn't he kind of blurry the distinction between space and time? Like he talked about space-time.
Space-time, yeah, it being sort of space-time being sort of molded and shaped by gravity, by large bodies, like viewing it space-time as sort of like the way I explained it to my little brother is I got a bowling ball, or like a big ball, and I put it on a sheet, and showed him like how space and time kind of curves with the weight of the object, and space-time being sort of the sheet that we were using.
Okay, I see.
And yeah, that's sort of like, it's sort of like time is almost like the fourth dimension in a way. Like it's like this sort of I want to say like linear dimension, but but yeah, space and time sort of shapes and molds depending on what bodies are around it, and I think there was these experiments where you fly up close to the edge of the atmosphere or whatever it is, and I can't remember what it was, whether I think time like sped up as you got further away or something like that, or time slowed down, because they had like two clocks perfectly synced, and they flew it around and they were off by however much. They're saying like if you go up there long enough, there's actually quite a substantial difference between the two clocks. Again, I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is there, but I'd have to refresh my memory.
Well, in any case, maybe if Einstein's concept of space-time is correct, maybe we could revise Kant a little bit, and maybe it's more accurate to say, the forms that we bring to experience are, it's this kind of blending of space and time into this homogeneous construct, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something I might be happy to revisit. I definitely need to brush up on my Einsteinian physics and whatnot. But it raises some interesting questions regarding how we know. So next question I wanted to address was looking maybe more specifically and more precisely at what do we know according to Kant's understanding. So for Kant, I think he argues something along the lines that knowledge is representational. So in some sense, it represents the world, maybe not as it is in and of itself, but at least as it appears to us. Mm-hmm. And so he talks about how a lot of our representations of reality are rooted in consciousness, and how this notion of consciousness perhaps being that underlying factor that accounts for how it is that we can have this representational knowledge of the way the world appears to us. And Kant talks about this in terms of like the way he justifies this is in terms of certain laws that are kind of have an objectivity to them, if that's the right word. And these laws, they're not derived from experience itself, but they are a priori functions, or they're rules of what Kant calls the understanding, which we apply to all of our experiences. So maybe we can kind of bring this down to earth and make more concrete sense of this. So getting back to these laws, though, to begin with, they're justified by the fact that when we judge certain things, we typically judge them according to a specific logical form. So, think of something like rules of inference or causation. So, if P then Q, P then Q. So, that's modus ponens. So, if all men are mortal and Socrates is wait, no. How do I want to put this? If all men are mortal, and if Socrates is a man, and Socrates is mortal. So that's just a basic rule of inference, right? We can also generalize this, matters of causation. like the dropping of the glass example I mentioned earlier. If I drop the glass from a certain height on a hard surface, then on average it's going to shatter. And so these are ways we judge reality. We judge them according to having this inherent logic, and it doesn't say anything about reality in itself, but it says lots of things about how we judge reality. And Kant would say that this activity of judging gives rise to the pure concepts of the understanding. So he would refer to these as like specific categories, like causation. And these pure concepts of the understanding, like causation, are then applied to pure forms of intuition. So they're applied to either space or time, like the way we experience space or time. And this thereby gives rise to a transcendental schemata, which is basically the rules of the application of the pure concepts to whatever sense impressions that we're receptive to. Mm-hmm. So that's a fairly technical bit of jargon I've just described there. So maybe we can elucidate that a bit more clearly.
Yeah, I think it was clear to me because I've been knee deep in Kantian terminology for so long. But maybe for people listening, I think we have the way I perceived it was, we have our senses, and they give us this raw data, and the raw data is presented to us in the form of in spatial and temporal forms. It has time and space to it. Our senses occur over here, over there, here, and now and or later or whatever.
Yeah. And
we're able to apply these categories and these concepts, and it sort of forms our general perception that we experience. Like we don't experience our raw sensory data. This is all sort of shaped and molded by the categories of the understanding into a coherent field of perception. And there's the term that I think Kant uses, the transcendental unity of apperception. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that sort of creates sort of this holistic sort of field. But it sort of makes sense. It helps us make sense and, I guess, categorize our experiences. It allows us to make judgments about things. It allows me to differentiate, my keyboard from my mouse, and, my computer, my monitor, all of those things. Mm-hmm. And it's the categories that really bring sort of reason to the table. It's what allows us to make sense of everything that's going on, everything that we're receiving through perception or through our intuition, I guess, as Kant would put it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think we're constantly judging our experiences. We're constantly trying to make sense of them, and we're constantly trying to make sense of them in virtue of, I suppose, a certain theoretical framework, a certain conceptual lens. We're always seeking to interpret what's going on around us, sense of it all. What caused what? How did this happen? And to that degree, we bring this schemata to bear on our experience. And to sort all of that out.
One way I remember viewing this is sort of like it's very Aristotelian, but it's they talk about this Copernican revolution of Kant's, where he sort of reverses the order. Copernicus, famously said that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. And what I see Kant doing here is internalizing matter and form to be something inherent to us. So like the intuitions are sort of like this raw matter, like this chaotic, like matter in a void that makes no sense, but it's our understanding that really brings shape and form to it, that, and that allows us to make sense of these things, that makes things the way that they are, or that makes things in general, So I see Kant kind of drawing from Aristotle a bit here for his philosophy. And that might be sort of a more intuitive way for, people in introductory philosophy classes to kind of make sense of what Kant is getting at.
Interesting. Yeah, I never drew the connection between Aristotle and Kant. I'd have to go back and look at my Aristotle and compare to Kant to see the relationship between their ideas. But
me and my ex, she was an Aristotelian and I was a Kantian, and we were always butting heads, and because they are quite different, but Kant still draws on a lot of Aristotle, I think, in his philosophy, and I knew he sort of changed logic to, kind of took logic away from Aristotelian logic a bit, but I think in order to do that, he had to still use Aristotle in some sense as a foundation.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's hard to escape Aristotle's influence. I mean, I think he's still influencing philosophers up until the present day, even though there might be philosophers who have, though they were influenced by him, they departed from him as far as how they conceptualized epistemology and so forth. Maybe just briefly, because we're nearing the end of our conversation time here, to touch upon some of the ways that Kant conceptualizes knowledge, and then if we have time, we can maybe briefly touch upon how he conceives that knowledge is justified and how it is that we know. So briefly, we previously mentioned earlier on in the conversation, what are the different kinds of knowledge, and we mentioned a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. So Kant is one thinker who really goes into this distinction in some depth in his writings. And of the a priori kinds of knowledge, knowledge which is independent of experience, there's one specific type which he calls, we've already mentioned it in passing, but he calls it a priori synthetical knowledge or synthetical judgments. And these are basically universal judgments, statements to the effect of all of something is the case or something like that. And they're generally propositional in nature, and they're based upon categories, and they apply to our sensory experience. So they apply to our certain empirical phenomena in space and time. And these judgments, moreover, are also laws that the understanding can't use this term legislates, but they're laws that the understanding legislates for nature. And they're laws that organize experience. So that's one kind of knowledge. And Kant says that most important example of a priori synthetical judgments are hypothetical judgments. And we've already kind of briefly been talking about this, but something like the principle of causation is sort of a classic example. And so the principle of causation is basically an a priori law that that all changes of a phenomena occur according to a rule of necessary connection of cause and effect. So, so A necessarily causes B, for instance. The limitation of that principle is that we can't know a priori what is the cause of any phenomena. To acquire that knowledge of cause of any phenomena requires that we have experience, but the a priori kinds of knowledge, are constituted by hypothetical judgments, like an if-then type of judgment, and this mode of judgment falls under the category of cause, and the category of cause is then applied to phenomena and time by the scheme of causation, and the rule that the cause of the phenomena is another phenomena that invariably precedes it in time. So that's fairly technical, but I guess it illustrates how it's the category of cause and effect is a priori, and we can have that understanding of cause and effects independently of experience. But if we're trying to understand some particular empirical phenomena, we require a posteriori knowledge, that experiential knowledge. Now, briefly, I'll just go over these last remaining questions, and whatever remaining time we can sort of touch upon any lingering issues and maybe just bring things to a wrap. So for Kant, what justifies knowledge? So there's two sources of justification. There's a priori justification, knowledge independent of experience. And then there's a posteriori justification, so which is justification that depends upon experience. And then to a second approximation of this question of how we know, Kant says there's two ways knowledge might be acquired. So in one sense, we acquire knowledge a priori, independently of experience, and we acquire knowledge a posteriori, or empirically through the senses. So that's a very just brief rundown of Kant's epistemology, and no doubt in some sense, probably not as accurate a analysis as it could have been, but I think it touched on some of the fundamental concepts and issues within his epistemology. And, I think it raises some interesting questions worth further pursuit, to get some maybe greater clarity on the answers to these questions, maybe better approximations to an answer at least. And so that's Kant in a nutshell, at least Kant's epistemology. So maybe I'll just briefly bring things to a summary, and if we have any other questions, we can touch on those. Otherwise, we can adjourn for the night. So throughout our conversation, we basically talked about some of the fundamental questions and issues and concepts and theories within epistemology. We talked about what knowledge is, what the specific kinds of knowledge are, what belief involves, what reasons we have for certain beliefs. And we specifically looked at Kant kind of as a exemplar for us to analyze as far as what his responses were to these questions. And hopefully we've gained a bit more clarity on some answers to the questions, or at least we have a clearer understanding of what the questions are and what some of the possible answers could be. So I mean, I feel like my epistemological knowledge has been somewhat clarified through this analysis. I don't know how this is all settling with you, Ryan.
Yeah, no, it's a really good refresher. This is one of my main areas of focus in philosophy was epistemology. Um, so this is like right up my alley in terms of my interests, and I touched on a lot of this through psychology and through philosophy. So it was a great revisit. Definitely a well-needed refresher, and I'm excited to see where it goes, in the future.
Yeah, no, I think I think this conversation has opened up the discussion and has raised some more questions worth pursuit. And I do agree it was a good refresher, and I think it's important that we did discuss these concepts in the depth that we did. I think in approaching philosophy, it's good to have a good grounding in epistemology, and I think in some sense it's perhaps one of the more fundamental branches of philosophy. Understanding it, how it is that humans know things, what knowledge itself is. I think if we're able to address these questions and shed some clarity and shed some light on these questions, I think we can better grasp some of the other issues within philosophy. If we first take care of these perhaps more basic or fundamental questions.
I think too, if you have an interest in metaphysics, Kant says like this is a undertaking that you have to engage in first. And I think maybe we'll get into this later, but talking about the limits of knowledge. So understanding how we know things and what are our limits for making judgments. And so I think epistemology is an important endeavor, an important undertaking to visit before you engage in something like metaphysics or even ontology.
Right. Yeah. Getting clear on how we know and what it is that we know, before we even actually attempt to address, the actual things that we do know. Yeah, no, I agree. So maybe on that note, I think we've definitely gone the distance over these last few hours, and I know that my brain at the moment is probably at its limit, and I'm at the limits of my knowledge as well. So perhaps we can revisit these issues again when we're maybe epistemically in a better position to address these questions. At least I know from my own, frame of reference right now. The way things seem to me at the moment are that it would probably be good to wrap up the conversation. So, on that note, thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we'll hopefully be have you tuning in for a future conversation on similar issues down the road. Bye for now.